Everybody. This is the Becoming a CG Pro podcast, and it's a great pleasure today to introduce to you Nick Jushchyshyn. He is a good friend of ours, a professor in virtual production. Nick teaches at Drexel University. Nick comes from the world of visual effects and has worked on some amazing projects, including Benjamin Button, which won the Oscar for visual effects. Worked at a lot of the big studios in the world, and now working to help teach the next generation of people about virtual production. And we'll probably talk about that quite a bit today. But anyway, welcome, Nick. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So, yeah, one question I'd like to ask everybody is kind of what got you started in all of this? Not what was your kind of your your path into computer graphics in the first place, and then kind of how that led to virtual production.
Yeah, sure. Like probably a lot of people of my generation, I was, of course, really uh, enthralled by movies. I mean, I think that really the summer blockbuster really emerged during my childhood with things like Jaws and Star Wars, and like it just started to come after that. And interestingly, I mean, as much as I loved Star Wars, and Star Wars was what my favorite films, um, it was, a year or so later, there was a television broadcast that was the making of Star Wars. And it was the first time I'd ever seen anything about how movies were made. And that actually caught my imagination every bit as not much, if not more, than the movie itself. The fact that, this universe that I had in my mind and I saw on screen and all this adventure. And it was cobbled together with plastic models and different parts of different things, and essentially the blood, sweat, and tears of a lot of really creative people. And that instantly captured my imagination, and it was something that I want to do that. That's great. And I lived I live on the East Coast, and so honestly, it was one of those kinds of things I set aside in my mindset, thinking like, it's all those cool kids that grow up in LA that get to do that. And about 10 years after finishing undergrad, I had been working as a computer programmer, project manager type of thing. Really, desktop computers had reached a point where they could handle basic digital video. Mini DV had come out. And so the process of filming something at home, getting it into your computer and editing it the way I had seen work done on films back in the 70s and 80s. It's like, wow, I could start doing that. And it became a hobby, and then it became an addiction. And then it became I could probably do this as a career now. I could probably chase this down. And I was the beneficiary of the fact that by the time I was really putting in effort in making a transition into that career, the film industry itself was going through a transition from the use of film to the use of predominantly digital tools. At the time, digital cameras on a film set were not really a common thing. There were only a few projects that had been shot digitally at all. There were huge debates at the time were going on as to whether digital projection would ever be appropriate. Everything that was digital was a digital intermediate, a DI, where it was shot on film, scanned frame by frame by frame, and then processed frame by frame by frame in post. So this transition was happening as I was trying to break into the industry, and it worked out for me because most people in the industry had about as much experience with digital as I did coming in fresh. And so I was able to apply myself to learning tools and learning workflows, and some new technologies were emerging at the time that artists in general didn't want to learn. So I was predominantly interested in getting into the industry, and artists were predominantly interested in creating really amazing images. So I stumbled across this newfangled thing called match moving and tracking and integration, and it was all of the photographing chrome balls and the mathematics behind high dynamic range imagery and creating lighting through photography and 3D tracking camera movements. And there were, at the time, not many out of the box software tools for doing that. And so it was this area that most other artists, even ones that wanted to break into the industry, you could just see their eyes glaze over. Like, can we get back to talking about textures? Can we talk about modeling again? Because like those are things I understand. And so to me, it was like, okay, that's what I'm going to learn, because it seems to be difficult for everyone else and not many other people want to do it. So I actually have a shot at getting in the door with this. It's just math. So so that's what I applied myself to for a number of years, just working at any kind of project I could in this space. I mean, I think the other advantage of that particular tool set is that it was also something that absolutely was necessary for any moving camera shot in any project. You had to track. And so it actually didn't take too long before I was able to get my toe in the door, work on some professional projects. And ultimately, like you mentioned, I really, really, really lucked out in getting into digital domain at the time that they were working on Benjamin Button. So that was definitely the kind of thing that where the stars aligned, where there was this opening. I was at the SIGGRAPH conference, and it said, "Hey, we're looking for trackers." I said, "I do tracking, and here's my demo reel, and I tracked this. Here's an actress's head. I tracked this thing for a professional project." And they're like, "So you know how to do that? And what software did you use?" And it happened to be exactly the software that they were using in their pipeline. And so, can you start on Wednesday? so that's how I got into computer graphics as a career. And the interesting thing, I think, coming into virtual production is that all of the tools that I ended up using in that pipeline on that project and many others were photogrammetry and high dynamic range imagery and spherical capture, and all of those things really lend themselves to creating the photorealism that we're seeing being leveraged in real-time engines now. And so it was kind of a natural shift. Again, I lucked out. I transitioned into teaching about 10 years ago. And when I joined Drexel University, at the time, there was a graduate student working on this idea that he had seen how James Cameron had used virtual production in the production of the Avatar movie, where he had a motion capture virtual camera rig on his shoulder, and he could frame up shots and see in a digital viewfinder what was happening. And at the time, of course, they were using things like Vicon motion capture systems, and Motionbuilder was something of an exotic tool at the time to realize all of that. But this student recognized that that's kind of like that screen. It's not too different than an iPad, and I can develop something in Unity for an iPad, and tracking, like I can do that with these Sony PlayStation Move controllers, and so I can write software for Unity with that. And so he basically built this kind of bootstrapped virtual camera system out of a PlayStation and a PC and an iPad. And that was his graduate thesis project. And it was phenomenal. And I mean, he ended up giving a SIGGRAPH talk, and seeing his work is really what planted the idea in my head. They're like, wow, this is really a thing. This is pretty amazing. I should probably pay some attention to that. So
I
in
might
the
know
10
who you're
years
talking
since,
about.
I've been diving. Yeah, I think you do. Yeah. So I think you've worked with him on a few films yourself. I mean, he worked with you guys on, I know, Jungle Book and Lion King and some stuff. And now he's at a major streaming service. I think he's pretty much heading. He's an executive in their kind of virtual production space. So I think that's, for me, one of the most exciting things about being a teacher is that it's not that it's just this dump of, well, here's what I did when I was in the industry, but it's more of a back and forth shared experience. And so it was really this student's work that planted the idea for me, myself, to kind of really pursue this area of investigation. And I've ran the animation visual effects program at Drexel for about 6 years, and over that time kind of managed to convince them that we have this game design program that uses game engines and designs games with it, and that's great. There's a lot of call for those students in industry. And we have this animation visual effects program which really focuses on this traditional post-process pipeline, using tools like Nuke and Maya and everything, Houdini, everything you would see in typical feature film industry. But there's this, whole new space that's gaining traction. There's, virtual reality, augmented reality headsets are now available for a couple $100s to the public. We've been working in this space for years, but it's always been really, really expensive, and kind of like specialty industries like the military or aerospace that was leveraging them. But this is really becoming commonplace at the consumer level, and we really should have a dedicated degree program that focuses on the unique challenges of this, because creating a world that actually envelops somebody, it's a different challenge than filling out a rectangular screen. It's not necessarily always the same thing as creating an interactive video game, but it's also not the same thing as rendering out frame by frame a finished product. And so the college, the university went for it, and now we have a program in immersive media, which includes VR, AR, but also all of our virtual production work is done in this space, because it's that overlap of real-time engines with the techniques and technologies that we've also been using in anim and VFX.
Amazing. Yeah, what a really interesting path, and really cool to hear the story of what inspired you and what kind of drew you into it in the first place. And there's definitely some resonance there with my own journey and being inspired by Jurassic Park, and then reading the making of book, and just that being the thing which really drew me in, because I was a nerd, still am, and really interested in kind of seeing behind the curtain and figuring out how it all works. And then yes, sounds like continuing to follow that that strand that curiosity, and letting that guide you into what interests you the most, and staying with that and following it as the industry has evolved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, super cool. So yeah, talking about virtual production, as you kind of landed there with your current passion in virtual production, we can see from your background you're obviously clearly very keen on virtual production, background and foreground, in fact. So yeah, I'd love to hear your kind of take on virtual production and what it is, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions, or maybe just generalizations about virtual production out there in the world, as some people have seen certain famous projects beginning with M that is becomes what people think virtual production is all about. But I know it's about a lot more than that, and I'd love to hear your take on what you consider it to be.
Sure. Yeah. So, in terms of what I consider it to be, and the potential, honestly, this little setup that, for those of you that are seeing this as video, I have these, fictitious heads up displays floating in front of me, holographic displays in the background. All of this is being done in Unreal Engine. And so I'm streaming live in my home, but I'm able to create this 3D environment around myself. And honestly, I use this day to day throughout COVID as my means of engaging with my students when we're doing remote classes. And this is a little bit of, I practice what I teach. A little bit of this is genuine purpose-driven functionality. So one example is that my camera is positioned in front of my desk. And so I have to deliberately look at that, because the computer screens that I'm using, I have two different computers, one on either side, and they're off axis from the camera lens. And so if I turn my head to look at the Zoom meeting in progress here, then it looks like I'm looking away from the camera. I'm just going to move the hologram over so I can see you a little bit better in my Zoom meeting. So if I look to my computer screen and there is no, I'm just going to move the hologram out of here. If there's nothing there, it kind of looks like I'm not paying attention. Like if I'm not speaking, I'm looking away from the camera, and maybe I'm reading email, maybe I'm doing something else. So I really, in one way, I really wanted to reassure my own students that if they're talking, that even if I'm not looking at the camera, I'm watching them, I'm listening to them, I'm looking at the work that they're showing. So that's kind of where the idea of bringing in these transparent holographic displays came in, is that now I can look off axis. I'm physically looking at a computer screen on my desk and, trying to position this virtual production, fictitious and transparent hologram in front of me, so that now I'm projecting what's happening to me in the real world. Is, yeah, Ed, I'm looking right at you right now in our meeting. So for me, this is some of the excitement of what the capabilities of virtual production are, because I think it has applications way beyond just entertainment and just broadcast. And it's kind of amusing to say just entertainment, because that's such a huge industry, and there are so many amazingly forward thinkers in these industries. Is really the pinnacle of the computer graphics research industry happens in entertainment and broadcast. So I don't mean to diminish the value of those industries, but at the same time, there's so much more that can be done. And so, the other thing that excites me about this is that I am doing this on a desktop computer at home. I mean, it's a really nice computer that could play, it could play a video game. Any current video game capable computer is capable of doing virtual production. And I don't have an LED wall. I don't have a motion capture system in this office. I have that back at the studio and all, but when I'm at home, I'm able to work in virtual production and able to create virtual production without any of that highly specialized equipment. I mean, Unreal Engine is available to be downloaded for free. And so if you have a computer with a decent graphics board that can run Unreal Engine, you could download the software for free and get started with it. You could create wholly computer imagery based animations and shows. I was lucky enough to be in the Unreal Fellowship not too long ago, and all of those projects were 100% computer generated imagery, so there was no live action whatsoever. So you didn't need even a specialized green screen studio. So I think that the actual accessibility of this technology is very, very exciting. I mean, really, I've taught high school students how to get started in it, and of course, college students. And so I think that the barrier to entry is actually lower than people realize. And so that's pretty exciting to me as well.
Amazing. Yeah. So I'm hearing you being on a Zoom call as being virtual production, as that's one strand of virtual production, and then obviously the show beginning with M, and that is also virtual production. That's why I treat it a bit like Macbeth these days, like as a word you're not supposed to say in the virtual production circles. Mandalorian. There you go.
Sure. Yeah. No, absolutely.
I broke my rule. But
there's no denying. I mean, as I mentioned, I am absolutely a hardcore Star Wars fan, and the emergence of the streaming series The Mandalorian is definitely one of the great high points of the history of Star Wars lore and things created for Star Wars. I would argue that, like, prior to Mandalorian, like maybe Rogue One was a great example of what could be done in that universe, in terms of an entertainment standpoint. But very rightfully so, the company that was created to create the original visual effects for Star Wars, Industrial Light and Magic, was originally launched, for the creation of that 1970s film. And so much of what is just a given today in digital imagery, really gravitated and came out of there, right? So, you look at Pixar and the entire industry of fully computer animated feature films. Pixar started out as a computer project inside ILM that was eventually spun off. I mean, it was, and it was spun off potentially as a computer company that ultimately transitioned into creating, some of the best computer animated films in the world. Um, we edit video digitally on on our handheld devices, on iPads, on all the desktop computers. And some of the earliest examples of that were edits, and I think it was the Avid system, I think, grew out of ILM. The seeds of that began as a software project inside ILM.
Was
So
it
it's no
the
surprise.
edit droid? I think it was
Yeah, I
referred
think it
to.
started out as Edit Droid,
Yeah.
and eventually becomes Avid, and then all of these tools. Um, I mean, just Photoshop, right? The fact that there's this verb in the vernacular of regular everyday consumers, it was born out of some work between an ILM modeler who was computer savvy, whose brother happened to be majoring, and I think he was doing a grad degree, if I remember the history correctly, in computer science. And kind of the two of them kind of collaborated on this idea of making it so that computers could edit photos, and again, so there's this thread of ILM through all of that. Of course, we're
John Knoll.
talking about Photoshop. Yeah, John
Yep.
Knoll and his brother, developing Photoshop, and that's such a staple of the entire photography industry, and all of this is it has threads that lead back to ILM. John now, of course, is a principal lead at ILM, and of course intimately involved with the production of Star Wars. So I think that there's no shame, or there's in the idea that you hear Mandalorian is yet again another example of Star Wars leading the charge in new technology. Again, going back to my transition into the film industry in the 2000s, when I mentioned that there were very few films being shot with digital, well, it was, if I remember correctly, episode 2 was shot on Sony Cinealta cameras. That was to my, I could be wrong on this, but I really feel like that was like a first major tentpole feature film that had been shot digitally. Like even episode 1 was shot on 35 millimeter film, converted to digital. And it was a passion of George Lucas to really try to push the industry towards digital, due to all of the pipeline, the workflow advantages in that space. So again, it's no surprise that here we have ILM and Lucasfilm, developing a new Star Wars property in Mandalorian, and leveraging all of the latest technology in an entirely new way, and yet again transforming the industry. So I think it's incredibly exciting. I can recall seeing LED walls shown years ago at SIGGRAPH conferences, and even I just, of course, I'm an idiot. I was just looking at them and I'm like, wow, it's a cool idea, but I don't know if that would ever really, like, would that really work in front of a camera? I mean, you could still, there's Morier patterns, there's so many challenges to solve. And, it should be no surprise that the folks at ILM were a big part of pushing that forward, and making something just absolutely amazing, compelling. And of course, the whole point is that the workflow improves. It improves the creativity of the directors, the performances of the actors. It adds versatility and speed to the production. And so there's just so many advantages to moving forward with these tools like LED walls and volume stages. So it's just, for me, it's an incredibly exciting time, because it was this transition in paradigms in the industry that helped me get in, and ultimately do what I always dreamed I really wanted to do. And so I see that same type of opportunity available to my students and others that are interested in breaking into the industry because of this new paradigm shift. There's so much demand to put it to use. And one of the main limiting factors is just how many people are skilled enough in the tool sets to actually put it together. I mean, there's a lot of job opportunities for folks. And so there's similar kind of opportunities that I was able to leverage back in the old days, are now available to newcomers today. So that's another exciting thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yeah, I'm getting more and more requests from people in the industry for people, because we also teach classes in virtual production, and people are becoming aware of that, and industry is really in desperate need of people with good skills, and they're finding it very difficult. And actually, one of the good things about that, it creates an opportunity for people to jump into something that's not only exciting but also that there is demand for, which is a good place to be in a place where there is demand, and also that the rates available, because there is a shortage of supply, are pretty good. I mean, really better than most other areas of visual effects currently. So definitely is a good thing to jump in on, for
Yeah,
sure.
I think there's an overarching business strategy called the blue ocean strategy, I think, something along those lines, where, if you go out to the deep blue ocean, there's fewer fish to compete against. You get closer to the shore, there's just all the organisms are competing for the same resources. So right now, if you're someone who is skilled in virtual production, it definitely seems that you're swimming in a blue ocean area right now. There is this whole innovator's dilemma going on, where I think that, prior to The Mandalorian really putting visibility of this tool set to the forefront of the industry, there was a bit of an innovator's dilemma in that, like, I don't know why I want to do that. Like, I already know how to do all these other things. But I think that, with productions like that and so many others now. So, you know, with the onset of COVID and, distancing work restrictions and things to protect everyone's safety, it also just happens to be that virtual production is well suited to distance production.
Right.
If people can remotely connect to create the assets that are used, you could create a TV show, involving a fire truck driving its way through Seattle, just by having the fire truck sit still in a studio and have, a few LED walls and computer controlled lights around it. And you can shoot a season's worth of fire truck driving scenes, in a couple of days inside a nicely controlled studio. And so there's so many other examples and advantages to it. It definitely provides some new challenges for us as educators, because again, the thing that's really important about being that valuable virtual production practitioner is that you actually know how to use those tools, right? There are nuances to, when you're using the end display technology that drives these LED walls, there are nuances to that the whole point of trying to find people that are experienced in it, that you just have to be aware of. If you're, some of it starts with having a good three-dimensional model of the actual surface of the wall. And, that three-dimensional model needs to be prepared a certain way. It needs two sets of texture UV spaces, so that there's one that goes edge to edge and another one that's proportional to the surface of the LED wall. So as educators, we do need to be able to provide experiences to our students to practice these things, so they do genuinely have that experience when they go out into the world. Because without that, then you're unprepared to step into that role and, like, oh, I didn't know that. And so it definitely puts us in some creative positions in terms of being able to teach how all of this technology works, how it fits together, how it integrates. So I'm lucky enough that the university that I work at, Drexel in Philly, we've, in part because of that grad student, back 10 years ago, we ended up building our green screen stage in a space that cohabitates with a Vicon motion capture system. And it wasn't much of a stretch. We had been working in, immersive media before VR headsets were common, involved, dome projection or cave projection. And so we had cave projection screens, really big projection screens around already. And it really didn't take for us very many steps to really connect the dots and say, okay, well, we can get end display working on a dual laser projector rear projection screen, and it's in the same space as our Vicon mocap system. So now we can track cameras and do a full virtual production wall shoot in our existing studio and have students gaining this experience. Even though we may not necessarily have the absolute latest, same exact LED wall technology that might be at a studio, I think a lot of studios are, doing everything they can to bootstrap these tools together. And so our students kind of get that experience by getting their hands on not only the software, but the hardware technologies, understanding how to keep everything in synchronization. Like as soon as you throw a projection system or an LED wall system into the same space as a camera, as a motion capture system, all of those systems need to be in precise synchronization so that you don't start to see those, frame scrolling artifacts and all kinds of other sync issues. And so, getting our students that opportunity to have hands-on time with these tools is really exciting, and it's great to do, and really important to do. So it's definitely a challenge, though.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, keeping up with it is a challenge because it's evolving so quickly. But you're in a similar position in a way to ILM in being able to have an R&D space where you can play with the stuff and put it together. And can you tell me a little bit, because I know that you touched on some really interesting stuff going through that, I know that everybody gets this impression it's all about the LED wall and the Mandalorian, and there's all these other flavors that you're describing. And LED is expensive and kind of prohibitively expensive to a lot of people. So as you mentioned, another solution in setting up a projection based system. Can you explain just kind of briefly how you would go about putting something like that together and kind of what it involves?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say I'm a little uncomfortable about the direct analogy of what I do to ILM, because they're literally in an
You're basically the same
universe.
as ILM.
No, not at all. Not even close. There's they're literally in their own universe. It's just amazing what they're doing. But
I
uh,
hear you, but
I
you are, you're doing something similar in a way to the beginning of that, where you have a space and you're playing with these new technologies and you're exploring what they can do. And that one of the things I love about virtual production is the fact that it's been such a great leveler. ILM has grown to this kind of monolithic, huge, almost impenetrable studios to some people. I actually made it in there at some point. It was a childhood dream of mine to be there, and I was absolutely like a kid in a candy store when I turned up there, because I grew up dreaming of being there and wanting to do it. And it was very hard. I got rejected a lot of times before I got in, but eventually made it. Um, uh, and they're doing their thing, but no, this technology has broken it open. It's like you said, it's made it available to so many more people. There's not to do maybe a Mandalorian type thing. There's a barrier to entry for that, for sure. There's a huge cost barrier to entry, but to do it at all, there isn't. And you've proved this with what you're doing. And I'd love to hear your take on kind of how you can do some of this indie style in a way that's much more accessible to people than having to fork out 100 grand a day just for a wall, on top of which you'd have to spend a lot more to run something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, looking to ILM for inspiration, the most important thing to take away is the pioneering spirit. I mean, and it just,
Yeah.
looks at a problem and will work towards solutions for it. I mean, I think there's a great documentary that I think might be underappreciated from The Mandalorian, and that's on the work that they did to create an actual physical model of the ship, the Razor Crest, and shoot motion control where, and this is John Knoll again, worked with a really small team just dedicated to the idea of, you know what, we'll build our own motion control rig from scratch and photograph this 3D model. And in that documentary, John talks about how the exercise of doing that and the creation of those shots not only generated shots that were used in the series, but also helped advance the level of quality on the CG side of things. And so, you know, there's a lot to be learned just from that pioneering spirit and the determination. And absolutely, I think that virtual production, it at kind of like the entry level for those of us that are working from home or our academic, you know, our teachers or students, the tool sets actually exist for us at the consumer level. So, you know, going to that example of the LED wall, you know, our virtual production wall at my studio is literally something we rescued from scrap. It was being thrown away. It was an obsolete rear projection screen. And we saw that it was being thrown away and it was like, no, we'll take it. You know, we'll find a place to keep it. And so we didn't spend a single dollar on the wall, the physical wall itself. So that was number one. It's just like, just keep an eye out for stuff that can be useful. The you know, the technology of the LED wall itself, you know, has its groundings in, you know, films from 100 years ago that were using rear projection and, you know, front projection, rear projection. You know, you have a projector, light shooting through it. The imagery of that is either bouncing off of a wall or projecting through some type of surface. Has been around for about a century at the very least. It's been used in theater. You know, Pepper's Ghost is a variant of this. And so these tools keep coming around again. And so for our own virtual production wall, we cobbled together a pair of laser projectors. So we're a school, we have lots of projectors. And so, you know, a pair of laser projectors. There's a software company called Scalable Displays that actually creates software that was intended for things like planetarium domes and, you know, large scale museum and you know, other types of event projections to align. You know, you just set up your projectors in approximately the right places where their imagery is overlapping, and then you just use a camera and scalable displays to kind of essentially calibrate all of those projectors into a single display. And so we were able to stack, you know, these two laser projectors and project them onto a single screen, overlapping, use this fairly common software that's been around for a long time to basically make it so that those two projectors would reliably always project pixel for pixel exactly on top of each other. So why is this important? Well, those projectors are a resource that we already have access to. And even if you were to buy those projectors brand new, the cost of buying those projectors brand new and the software to calibrate them is less than 10% the cost of a similar, like, purchasing or even renting an LED wall. So like, I think, you know, you'd mentioned something about like a 6-figure rental for an LED volume on a day basis. Well,
yeah,
you know, it costs less than 10% of that day rate, you know, if you were to buy those projectors brand new. And part of that is because you know, if you look at what the cost of a 10,000 lumen or 15,000 or brighter projector, I mean, even that is plural tens of thousands of dollars. But when you get under that 10,000 lumen value, the price of the projector drops like crazy. So that was why we stacked two of them. We had two, you know, relatively inexpensive projectors, you know, each of them less than $5,000. And by having them be able to overlap perfectly, now we have this, you know, more than 10, we're over 10,000 lumens between the two of them. And they're perfectly aligned. And now we have all of the light value, the contrast that we would want to be able to practice virtual production, just like you would with an LED wall. So, you know, again, we're privileged to have that studio space and the ability to pull in these projectors and do all of that calibration. You know, that's really wonderful. But some of the things that, you know, we can also do with that is that, you know, just mentioning that end display technology also hinges on having a good 3D, an accurate three-dimensional model of the surface of that screen. And traditionally that might be a prohibitive thing to like bring in a proper LiDAR scanner to do that. But you can get iOS devices. Apple would be happy to sell you a consumer, cell phone or iPad that has LiDAR built into it, and you can get a really good three-dimensional model with accurate measurements using that consumer tool. And we could basically, that's exactly how we 3D scanned our projection surface, so that we had an accurate three-dimensional model of that. And then downstream from that, again, we do have a motion capture system already in the same space. So it was just connecting the dots of tools that we already had to be able to
So
create that.
with the screen, once you've done the scan, presumably you
Mhm,
then have to remodel it so it's a tidier model on top of that.
mhm.
But basically, you're using the lidar as a guide to give you the accuracy.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So with the LiDAR scan, we could get an accurate uh, an accurate scan of the surface itself. And it's not professional LiDAR quality, but we can see where the corners are, we can see where the surface is. And then yes, in a standard digital content creation DCC tool, we tend to use Maya, but anyone could use Blender for free, and any number of tools. We could essentially three-dimensionally trace that 3D scan model and use that clean model that we created by hand. When you're used to teaching students how to 3D model characters, performance characters, and props and rooms and settings and vegetation and all that, suddenly creating a 3D model traced from a scan of an essentially flat or curved surface is, we can do that. That's no problem. So from that, we were able to create that model. And really, you don't even need that LiDAR scan from an iOS device. You could use photogrammetry, which is just taking lots of photos from lots of different angles. And they're using those photos and software. There's a free tool, I think, called Meshroom. It's common to have photogrammetry software. I think Autodesk, if you're a school, a student and or a teacher can use Autodesk tools at no charge in
Yep.
teaching situations. And so Autodesk
Reality
has
capture
a
is
tool.
also very cheap as well.
Reality
Now they have
capture it's owned by Epic is very inexpensive. Yeah, you only pay on a per scan, actually,
paper image.
pay per image type of basis. And
It's
even
about 20 cents for a 200 image model. It's pretty cheap.
exactly. Dedicated tools like Agisoft has a Metashape, and again, in the educational market, they actually have discounted software, and I think it's under $100 to get that. So you could create a photogrammetry scan with just a collection of less than 100 photos, and then with a single reference measurement, like, okay, I know that the length of this rod is 6 feet. Now you've got a proper scaled essentially very similar to a LiDAR scanned model. And all of this said, like, again, we're kind of privileged to be able to have that studio, to have this big wall, to have a mocap studio. But the interesting thing is that you don't necessarily need to have all of that. You could use just a computer monitor or just a television with maybe miniatures in front of it, or just a very large screen, and you could do kind of head and shoulders shots. Again, if the screen is completely flat, well, the 3D model is pretty trivial to make. It's just a two-dimensional plane. And so with a few good reference measurements, you can model that accurately in 3D. And even the motion capture system, you can use a consumer Vive VR system, the concept that tracks that VR headset through space, and the handheld controllers and the little tracker pucks. It's exactly the same as a mocap system. It might not be quite as precise. It might not be tracked as accurately in synchronization with your camera frames, but you can absolutely practice all of the core steps of that production with a setup like that. And you don't even need the Vive system, by the way. Again, in academic settings, Autodesk software is available at no charge. And there are Unreal Engine Live Link plugins for Maya and Motionbuilder. So really, you could open up Unreal Engine for free, and you can open up Maya, and with the Live Link plugin, put a camera in Maya and just move that camera around. And in real time, by connecting that in Live Link, you're now moving a camera around in Unreal Engine. And it's exactly the same principle as you would use if you had, a six-figure motion capture system. In fact, um, I know that many motion capture virtual production pipelines will take the streaming data from the native motion capture system, whether it's Vicon, OptiTrack, or whatever, and live stream that into Motionbuilder to be relayed into Unreal Engine. So the practice of opening up Motionbuilder, which again, software that's been around for like 20 years at least or more, and animating it and moving a camera around inside Motionbuilder and then driving a Unreal Engine camera with that, you're doing almost literally what's happening on a professional stage that's using these technologies.
Yeah, and going back not too far to Jungle Book, that was kind of how that worked, being driven by Motionbuilder, but then kind of being rendered through Unity and Photon on top of that. But yeah,
Mhm.
it's still useful in the process, even though it's been around that long. Some other obviously tools are competing with some parts of it, but yeah, still
Yeah,
a
I
big
think,
player in the space, especially with manipulating the mocap and cleaning it and editing
yeah,
it.
I mean, one of the things that I did get involved in early on was motion capture cleanup, and one of the first motion capture tool I ever learned to use was Motionbuilder back in those early 2000s. I think I still have a manual from 2002, and it's surprisingly still relevant today.
Similar. Yeah.
But the and that I believe was the software hub that was being used for in the production of Avatar. I think you can go and look at
Mm.
behind the scenes virtual production being demonstrated in James Cameron teams working on that. And I think Motionbuilder was the real-time graphics engine that was displaying the animated aliens and creatures for the live action talent being filmed, and it was also being used to create the imagery for the virtual production, the virtual camera system, and things like that, because it was so well suited for taking live streamed motion capture data and in real time creating camera or character animation with it. So I know that there are a number of tools that are actually deliberately Unreal Engine, and I know it's no secret side effects, with Houdini. There's quite a few tools that are really, really working concertedly to get what the functionality, the value functionality of Motionbuilder natively within their own ecosystems. And they've made great strides in that, but even so, like there's still just things that I feel like I can do in Motionbuilder very quickly, very easily, and very intuitively, that it just isn't quite there in these other tools. So they're working at it. I'm sure that they'll get there eventually.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like Motionbuilder's going developing a whole lot of amazing new functionality right there, and so I'm sure it won't be too long before these other tools really catch up to that.
And Houdini's
But it's
a
just,
really interesting
yeah.
style of doing it too, because it's doing it typically procedurally, so that a lot of the setup and work that you do is non-destructive and procedural, and that there's some huge advantages to doing it in that way. They were doing it in a really crazy way too. They're actually doing it in SOPs, which is geometry, not like
Mhm.
an actual skeleton as such. Skeletons are just points effectively, but
Mhm.
they're using actual geometry for the skeleton, and given that you can actually run the skeletons through all of the operations that you've got available to geometry. Suddenly you could run it through a deformer and have the skeleton deform in some crazy way. Literally, it's kind of mind blowing, but seeing these people doing that is really, really exciting.
Absolutely. And I'm excited to see side effects and Epic, kind of, working together. I know Epic, I think, invested in side effects. There are a lot of natural synergies between those solutions,
Mm.
because Houdini is, this procedural tool where you kind of build out a set of instructions for the software to execute through, graphically, through using node trees and essentially decision networks. Now do this, now do this, instead of a traditional timeline approach. And that's very much similar to the approach of using a real-time game engine for interactive games, because you want to set up, when you're creating a game in an engine like that, you're setting up rules for what is to happen when the user is accelerating the character. Like, okay, my character's standing still, and then they push the joystick forward and the character starts to walk, and then they push the joystick really far forward, or they press a button and now the character needs to run or jump or do an attack. And you know the there's no animation, there's no predetermined director deciding what's the framing of the camera and at what point in the story does this attack happen. There's a user, and there's millions of users in the world. They're all going to make their own decisions about when that happens. So, game engine software is designed very procedurally, so that, okay, when this button gets pushed, I need to transition from this animation to this animation based on what state I'm currently in. And that's very much how Houdini projects are built. I usually, when I'm teaching Houdini, I like to use crowd sims as kind of like the gateway drug to Houdini, because a crowd sim touches on so many of the core tool sets of texturing and rendering and the geometry and bringing in an animated skeletal mesh and iterating that and instancing and then decision trees. I'm running away now. Now it's safe. I don't need to run. And all of those constructs in Houdini are not entirely dissimilar from the same type of arrangements inside something like Unreal Engine for games.
Yeah, I didn't know you taught Houdini as well. I also do teach
Yeah.
Houdini. Haven't done for a few months, but yeah, it's cool. It's an incredible tool.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I definitely have to. I'll give a shout out to Deborah Isaac. That I dabbled with teaching in Houdini, and I can introduce people to it and get them hooked on it, and then I kind of pass them on to Deb Isaac, and so we have her teaching a lot of our core Houdini classes, and so that's we definitely have like a track in Houdini, and our program is actually like one of those Houdini certified partners, and just like we are with Epic for Unreal.
cool.
But it's definitely it's definitely a different world, and it's always good to have someone who really specializes in those spaces to come in. And just, I'm impressed with people like you that are so skilled in so many tool sets. It's a lot of times you can find someone who's a generalist, and I feel like I'm more of a generalist myself, and knows a bunch about lots of different tools. And then there's just the amazing things that specialists can do, because they live, eat, and breathe this tool
Mm.
set, and it's just like deep dive. And I think my experience with you is that you've got a really amazing blend of both of those things. So yeah, it's really cool.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I think I beat my head against the wall to try and earn some of those skills, but and I'm definitely a generalist as well. And try not to spread myself too thin, which I think is a good tip for anyone starting out. And I definitely didn't start out by trying to learn everything at the same time, but kind of periodically switching from one thing, focusing to something else, but focusing on that to be able to go as deep as possible. But there's always, like you say, the specialists that then take it from there and focus on it all the time. So like animators are a good example. They just do that all day, every day, and they get extremely good at it. And I can animate a character, but if I wanted somebody to do it properly, or quickly at least, I would definitely hire a real animator, I would say. Um,
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions coming in before we
Oh,
wrap. I'd love to
sure.
ask a couple of
Absolutely.
those from the audience. Um, so one, which is a big question possibly. Hi Nick, what do you think about where the industry will be 10 years from now?
Wow. That
That's a big
I'm just
question.
going to say that's like the impossible question, because I mean, I can say that, my first introduction to virtual production happened 10 years ago. And it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. Um, you know, I had lots of moments like, oh, that's interesting. I should go into that. So I just because I happened to be intrigued by virtual production 10 years ago, and here it is, like, a it's developed into, a mainstream kind of thing. There were plenty of non-mainstream things that I was also interested in, pursued, and they didn't necessarily explode the way virtual production has today. So I'll just start out saying that I'm in no way clairvoyant. So,
We
but
won't
I
hold you
do,
to it, don't worry.
yeah.
We'll bring the
I mean, I
recording
think
back 10 years and judge you against it.
there's no escaping the fact that technology constantly improves, and it seems to generally improve faster than anyone who's currently involved believes is possible. So the thing that I feel that I saw happening in the film industry as I was entering was there was a lot of um, entrenched industry pushback of like, this digital thing will never be as good as film. It'll, it's not the same thing. It's not going to be, it's not just not, you can't produce that. You just can't do it. It's too far away. And really everything, within 10 years of that, it started to get to be hard to buy film, because film companies that produced actual film, like the product to put in your camera, were going out of business because of lack of demand, because consumers switched to digital, and that transition just worked its way through the industry. And so computers continually get faster. You've got companies like Nvidia and AMD and Intel that are constantly improving the technologies. I mean, you mentioned Jurassic Park. So that was the year I graduated from university myself, in 1993. And I think that it's just mind-boggling. If you were to open a Wayback Machine, or do a little bit of history sleuthing to find out what is the top of the line PC and Macintosh computer available in 1993, and 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 what we have commonly on our desktops right now, that what our kids use to play Fortnite, whether it's a console. I mean, most of our handheld devices
The phones are,
way
yeah, they're more
outclass,
powerful
you
than
know
those. Yeah,
and not only that, but they're all connected to every other most powerful device on the internet at the same time. Like, even back then, there was, like, Ethernet wasn't common. I mean, honestly, email wasn't a thing that students had when I graduated from university in 93. Like, I didn't have an email address when I graduated from university. AOL was kind of, Prodigy were kind of things that were developing. So in 10 years, the power that we have on our desktops now, that costs a few $1,000s, is probably going to be miniaturized. And so, the things that we say are limiting about wearable devices that don't have the graphics fidelity that we would get out of a workstation type of machine, it wouldn't surprise me if wearable devices actually have that kind of fidelity. And so, what would you do with that technology? What could you do with AR, with VR, with other types of interaction, when the power of a workstation, fits on your belt buckle or on in your glasses? So that'll be that's what I'll say about what's coming in the next 10 years.
amazing. Well, another really quick one before we wrap is what would be your suggestion for a really great video to intro virtual production, particularly LED wall, Mandalorian style, etc., to an audience of non-technical producers? Ideally, like a sort of 1 minute video teaser that wows them and makes them want to buy into it.
Oh, actually, there are a few, and I don't know if I can find their names really easily. There's a studio in the UK called Simply Brilliant,
Mm.
that has a couple virtual production demos. And what I like about their demos is that they take a very practical approach, um, in that they're demonstrating the use of LED wall virtual production for something small, like a commercial or like a TV, something that you would maybe normally shoot like in an office or in a home. And instead of going through all the effort to build out a physical set, you know that you can, put together a digital one rather quickly, have it on that LED wall volume, and shoot what might otherwise be a traditional shot. And I think their demos show that you can, within a day or two, get through a dozen or more different locations, different lighting setups, different types of day, time of day. So that's one. And there's also a company, I can't remember if they're in New Zealand or Australia, that has some virtual production demo videos from that same type of indie film production type of point of view. So I could search for it, but we'd run out of time waiting for me to
Yeah.
find it. But I find those to be the most compelling because they do share some behind the scenes so you could see what's going on with the technology, and you can also get a good inkling about what's so powerful about it. So you could push a compact car into this studio and have someone sitting moving the steering wheel but get a sense of reflections playing over that. It's not the same as a green screen. You're actually, the actor has an environment to react to around them. And these are very, very practical setups that are not, a galaxy far, far away with, fantastic, creatures and spaceships and things like that, but instead are very practical applications that you could see would be far more expensive and complicated to execute outside in the real world, that become far more controllable and trivial inside a studio environment. So those are two that I think stand out to me.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Well, I just want to say thank you very much, Nick, for joining us on this podcast. I really appreciate your time and your wisdom. And as always, it's a pleasure talking with you. And thank you for sharing everything with our listeners. To everybody out there, thank you also for joining us on this podcast. You can connect with us in our Facebook group, Becoming a CG Pro, on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to subscribe to that. We have our podcast on there and a number of other growing body of videos on there. We also run classes in virtual production, so becomecgpro.com. You can check out some of the things that we do on that website. And Nick, do you have a good way that people can find out more about what you're up to as well? You able
Yeah,
to share any
absolutely.
links to the university or?
Absolutely. So, the university website is drexel.edu. So my last name hopefully is in your show notes somewhere because it's,
Yeah.
11 letters and only one of them is officially a vowel. So it's definitely a copy paste affair. But if you search Drexel in my name, it wouldn't take you long to find my email address. Certainly, if I'm going to plug anything, I would say if you know anyone in high school that's interested in pursuing this field, definitely, send them our way, because we literally have a degree program that's really focused in this. And our students end up working in industry. We have co-ops, so that, in between classes, they're actually working in industry. And so I'm really proud of that experience for our students. So anyone who's already, out in industry and wants a really professional compact program, definitely the Becoming CG Pro thing that you're doing is wonderful. But I'm also happy to address any questions and things like that. And so I think that's all I have to share.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, thank you for sharing it. And again, thanks very much for being here with us. And we will see you soon. We'll have another episode in 2 weeks. And thank you very much.
All right. Thanks for having me.